January 11th, 1915, Northern Ireland. A child is born who will one day become the most terrifying man the Second World War ever unleashed. Edward Henry Paddy Mayne entered the world in a quiet town, in a respectable home, with a father who practiced law and a mother who obeyed strict order. Nobody knew that this baby would grow into something the war had been waiting for. A mind engineered for violence, a body designed for brutality, and instincts that belonged to something closer to a predator than a soldier. While other boys learned manners, Mayne mastered rage. While other children played, he stalked the fields like a hunter, searching for something to fight. Teachers whispered about him. They didn't say it out loud, but they knew something wasn't right. He learned fast, but only when it interested him. He obeyed rules only when they made sense to him, and to him, most didn't. And when someone pushed him, they usually ended up on the floor. By the time he reached grammar school, he was already a problem. Not because he was a bully. Bullies picked targets weaker than themselves. Mayne didn't care who you were. If you provoked him, he attacked with an explosive violence no one his age should have possessed. He didn't start fights. He finished them. His body grew faster than everyone else's. His fists hit harder. His temper was shorter. And buried underneath all that muscle was a mind that reacted to conflict with an almost frightening calm. When other kids panicked during a brawl, Mayne's heartbeat slowed down. His senses sharpened. He became cold, focused, efficient. It was as if violence didn't scare him, it steadied him. He tried following his father's path into law, attending Queen's University Belfast. But lecture halls could never contain a storm like him. His real education happened on rugby fields and in boxing rings, where he demolished opponents with hits that felt like they were thrown with the intention to break bone. Spectators loved him, coaches feared him, opposing players avoided him. On the 1936 British and Irish Lions tour, he didn't just play rugby, he fought rugby. Tackles were collisions, scrums were street brawls. His teammates respected his skill but stayed out of his way. Nobody wanted to be the next man he knocked cold like the poor player he once flattened after a single argument. It wasn't personal, it was instinct. But beneath all the chaos, something else was happening. Something even Mayne couldn't see. Every time he hit someone, every time he felt bones bend or heard a body collapse under his weight, a piece of him felt at home. That was the part the war would exploit. When Britain entered World War II in 1939, the world panicked. But Paddy Mayne didn't panic. He smiled. The war didn't scare him. It gave him purpose. Finally, everything inside him, the anger, the strength, the cold calculation, had a place to go. He joined the Royal Artillery first, but it felt like a cage. Too many rules, too much waiting, too much distance between him and the enemy. He wanted to see faces when he fought. He wanted to hear their breath, their fear, their shock. A long-range gun wasn't enough. He needed something closer. That's when he found the Commandos, Britain's earliest special assault forces. Training broke most men. It didn't break Mayne. It shaped him. He pushed through freezing oceans, scaled cliffs and storms, fought hand-to-hand until both men testing him were left bruised and breathless. He didn't hesitate, didn't complain, and didn't slow down. Something terrifying was happening. This wasn't a man adjusting to war. This was a man discovering his natural environment. His first taste of real combat during Operation Claymore proved it. While bullets snapped through the air and smoke turned the shoreline gray, Mayne moved with a strange, controlled fury. He didn't flinch. He didn't rush. He simply advanced, firing methodically, studying every angle like an artist calculating the brushstrokes of violence. When it was over, the others celebrated. But Mayne? He just looked disappointed. The fight hadn't been enough. It hadn't pushed him deep enough into danger to satisfy whatever lived inside him. Then came a chance encounter that changed everything. David Sterling. Tall, ambitious, dangerous. Sterling had a vision for a unit that didn't fight like regular soldiers. A unit that didn't wait for orders or follow standard rules. A unit built for assassinations, sabotage, and behind-the-lines terror. A unit made for men like Mayne. People warned Sterling that Mayne was too violent, too unpredictable, too much of a liability. Sterling didn't care. He wasn't building gentlemen. he was building weapons. And Paddy Mayne wasn't just a perfect fit, he became the blueprint. The Special Air Service was nothing in the beginning. A name, an idea, a handful of misfits. And then Paddy Mayne joined, and suddenly it wasn't just real, it was terrifying. Every operation in the North African desert pushed Mayne further into the type of war he was born for. The kind where silence killed, where night covered the bodies, where he could walk right up to the enemy and destroy them before they even knew he was there. The desert is a graveyard for the unprepared. Endless sand, blinding heat, cold nights, no cover, no mercy. But Mayne thrived. The isolation sharpened him. The quiet steadied him. Out there, surrounded by nothing but wind and dunes, he became something primal. The SAS specialized in hitting German airfields deep behind enemy lines. These weren't simple raids. These were surgical strikes in pitch-black darkness carried out with knives, explosives, and the calmness of death. Mayne memorized patrol paths, counted footsteps, timed guard rotations. He didn't attack until everything was perfect. And when he did, it was like watching execution disguised as strategy. One night in December 1941, Mayne crawled through the sand toward a German airbase so heavily guarded that the expectation of survival was nearly zero. But Mayne didn't fear death. Men who fear death hesitate. He didn't. With only knives and charges, he moved through sleeping aircraft like a shadow with murder in its hands. He placed explosives under fuel tanks, clipped wires, ripped through canvas, and slit throats with a quiet efficiency that shocked even his own unit. When the sun rose, the desert glowed orange with the flames of 24 burning German aircraft. Pilots ran in panic. Alarm bells rung too late. German officers later described it as an attack by ghosts. No, not ghosts. One man leading a team that followed him because they feared him more than they feared the Germans. But Mayne didn't care about their fear. He cared about perfection. If a man stumbled, he corrected it violently. A bad step could end a mission. A bad mission could kill them all. He expected total discipline, and when he didn't get it, he delivered it with his fists. These weren't rules for him. They were instinct. His brutality wasn't random. It wasn't emotional. It was calculated, controlled, precise. To him, violence was just another tool, a way to shape men, a way to mold fear into obedience. And he molded the SAS into something terrifying. When Sterling was captured in 1943, the SAS needed a leader who could turn chaos into advantage, someone who could operate without limits, someone whose mind was already wired for clandestine war. Paddy Mayne stepped forward, and the SAS changed forever. He didn't bark orders from the back. He led from the front, walking into danger like he was immune to bullets. Every raid he touched became louder, faster, and far more violent. He didn't just kill German soldiers, he erased them. He created panic, confusion. He turned German strongholds into smoking graves. In Sicily, he carried out night raids so brutal that German commanders believed the British had deployed an entire battalion. In reality, it was often just a handful of men led by someone who understood how to weaponize terror. Tanks exploded in silence. Outposts vanished. Entire groups of soldiers disappeared without a trace except for the way their bodies were found, broken in ways that suggested close-quarters combat far more savage than military necessity required. There were rumors, whispers among captured Germans, of a large, silent man who killed with his bare hands when ammunition ran low. One described finding an officer whose skull had been crushed so completely it looked like a caved-in tin cup. Another body had eyes gouged out, fingers broken, a neck twisted until the vertebrae separated. No one could confirm if Mayne did these things, but no one doubted he could. By the time the Allies prepared for the invasion of France in 1944, Mayne wasn't just feared, he was mythologized. He moved through villages like smoke, ambushing German convoys with such speed that even the survivors struggled to explain what happened. Some said they never saw him coming. Others swore he was everywhere at once, firing from impossible angles, disappearing before they could aim. His brutality wasn't reckless. It was strategic. He understood fear better than most commanders. He weaponized it. A terrified enemy makes mistakes. A terrified enemy hesitates. and hesitation is fatal. He burned German command posts to ash, executed soldiers who surrendered too slowly, shot wounded enemies to prevent them from rejoining the fight. His methods weren't pretty, and they weren't gentle, but they worked. Everywhere Mayne went, German resistance crumbled faster than intelligence predicted. Behind the brutality was a man shaped by something darker than patriotism, something deeper than strategy. Mayne wasn't fighting for politics or ideology. He was fighting because the battlefield was the only place where the violence inside him made sense, the only place where he didn't feel out of place, the only place where he didn't feel wrong. The war didn't create Paddy Mayne, it revealed him. Dawn in Normandy was not gentle. It didn't rise with warm colors or bird song. It crawled in like a wounded animal, dragging the smell of burnt metal and rotting flesh behind it. While Allied forces were still fighting tooth and nail on the beaches, Paddy Mayne had already slipped miles behind enemy lines with a handful of men who followed him because they knew one truth. Staying close to Mayne was the safest place in hell. Not because he protected them, but because enemies focused on him first. He was impossible to ignore. He hit the French countryside with the same silent aggression that had defined him in the desert. The bocage, those ancient, thick hedgerows, were nightmares for most soldiers. For Mayne, they were cover. They were traps waiting to be sprung. He moved through them like a wolf through tall grass, using the tangled roots and shadows to stay invisible until he chose to reveal himself. And when he revealed himself, people died. The SAS mission after D-Day was simple and terrifying. Destroy everything the Germans could use. Bridges, rail lines, fuel depots, convoys, ammunition trucks, communication hubs. Anything that kept the German war machine moving needed to go up in flames. And Mayne approached each target like it was a personal insult that it still existed. On his second day behind enemy lines, he intercepted a German convoy transporting ammunition. He didn't wait for the ideal angle. He didn't calculate the risk. He didn't whisper orders. He just raised his fist, a silent signal, and sprinted out of the hedgerow like a man who had already accepted death or had forgotten why anyone should fear it. His men followed because they had no choice. The ambush was over in under a minute. That wasn't an exaggeration. A full German convoy was destroyed in 60 seconds. Mayne came at them from the front, spraying a full magazine before the lead truck even realized what was happening. The driver swerved in panic. Some jumped out, unarmed. Some tried to surrender. Mayne shot them all. He didn't leave wounded enemies behind. He didn't allow survivors. He didn't want the Germans to be able to report anything useful. Just bodies and smoke. When the ammunition truck finally went up, the explosion lit the entire hedgerow like a lightning strike. His men dove for cover. Mayne didn't. He stood there watching the flames rise, his face lit orange, his silhouette hulking and still. It terrified even the men who had fought beside him for years. That was the moment they realized something crucial. Mayne wasn't just efficient. He wasn't just brave. He wasn't just aggressive. He was something else entirely, something forged differently, something built for war like the rest of them were built for breathing. And the deeper they went into France, the darker he got. German officers wrote reports describing a giant figure leading attacks in the night. They said he seemed to appear out of nowhere, that he didn't hesitate, that he moved like he didn't feel fear or pain. One officer, captured later, said he saw Mayne charging through gunfire as if bullets were an inconvenience. That wasn't bravery, it was something colder. A few nights later, near a farmhouse that served as a German communication hub, Mayne staged an assault so brutal that even the SAS veterans who had fought with him in North Africa were left silent afterward. He approached the building alone, without waiting for backup, kicked the door open, and stormed inside like a force of nature. The first German soldier inside tried to raise his rifle. Mayne crushed his throat with the butt of his gun before the man could even inhale. Another lunged at him. Mayne grabbed the man's helmet, ripped it off, and smashed it into his face until the metal bent around bone. Blood splattered the walls like paint. The desk snapped when he slammed another soldier into it repeatedly, breaking the wood, breaking the man, breaking everything. By the time his men rushed in, the screams had already stopped. There were no survivors. There were no intact bodies. There was no mercy. Outside, the world was quiet again, but inside Mayne's mind, something was unraveling, thread by thread. He didn't show emotion. He didn't smile. He didn't shout. He didn't even look pleased with what he'd done. He just knelt, pulled out explosives, and wired the entire building with the same calm precision a man might use to tie his shoes. When the farmhouse exploded minutes later, the night sky flickered like a dying star. The blast echoed over the fields, and the only man who didn't flinch at the sound was Paddy Mayne. As the SAS moved deeper into occupied France, Mayne's tactics evolved into something even more lethal. He stopped thinking like a soldier and started thinking like a hunter. He set traps in the dead of night, using abandoned villages as kill zones. He studied wind direction before ambushes, understanding how sound carried through ravines. He attacked convoys from angles that defied logic, cutting off retreat routes before the enemy even realized they were surrounded. Every mission he touched became a masterclass in destruction. One night near Saint-Lô, his unit approached a small town hall being used as a German command post. Inside were officers who were using local civilians as human shields. Villagers whispered that torture was happening inside. People begged Mayne for help, but they also warned him. The Germans would kill the hostages if they sensed a rescue attempt. Mayne listened quietly. His expression didn't change. He lit a cigarette, took a slow drag, nodded once. Then he gave an order that chilled even his own men. He told them to surround the building and block every exit. He didn't break in. He didn't negotiate. He didn't warn the Germans. He burned the building. Flames climbed the walls in seconds. Screams erupted from inside. Officers shouting orders. Civilians crying out. The chaos of a place transitioning from fear to panic to death. German soldiers jumped from windows. Mayne shot them the moment they hit the ground. He didn't let any of them escape. Was it ruthless? Absolutely. Was it necessary? Maybe not. But in Mayne's mind, the Germans inside had already crossed every moral line. He wasn't killing enemies. He was wiping out the disease they spread. That's how he saw it. Each kill wasn't strategic. It was personal. Reports from German survivors of nearby units described the incident in trembling detail. They said it felt like the devil himself had come for them, that the man outside the burning building looked unaffected by the fire, like he was standing in a warm breeze instead of the heat of collapsing beams and boiling air. They weren't exaggerating. Mayne's boots melted slightly from the heat. He didn't move. But the deeper the SAS pushed into France, the more obvious it became that something was changing inside him. The violence wasn't just around him anymore. It was inside him too. He stopped sleeping for more than an hour at a time. He jerked awake, gripping his weapon, eyes wild, searching the darkness for enemies who weren't there. His men learned not to touch him when waking him up. He reacted with immediate, blinding brutality, swinging fists before he even opened his eyes. He drank more, smoked more, spoke less. But when the sun rose and it was time to kill, he was sharper than ever. Clear, focused, efficient. Death steadied him in a way rest never could. By autumn, German forces were beginning to fear the SAS more than American bombers or British armor. At least with aircraft, you heard them coming. With tanks, you felt the rumble of the ground. But with Mayne, you didn't hear or feel anything until your life was already ending. A German officer once described a firefight where he saw Mayne running directly at a machine gun nest. Not crawling, not crouching, running, straight forward, full speed, no fear, no hesitation. The officer claimed Mayne fired only short, controlled bursts while closing the distance, his aim perfect even under fire. When he reached the nest, he jumped into it like a man leaping into water and killed everyone inside with a knife. The officer said the terrifying part wasn't the brutality. It was that Mayne's expression never changed. Not during the charge, not during the killing, not afterward. It was like watching a man change weapons, not emotions. This wasn't normal courage. It wasn't adrenaline. It wasn't madness either. It was something far more unnerving. It was a man who had found his purpose, and that purpose was violence. The deeper the SAS moved into France, the more the Germans whispered his name like a curse. Some thought he was a myth, a propaganda invention meant to scare them. Others thought he was some kind of demon in human form, incapable of dying. Soldiers joked darkly that if they killed Mayne, he'd probably just get back up. But Mayne wasn't supernatural. He wasn't invincible. He was human. A human who had discovered that war wasn't just where he excelled, it was where he belonged. And that realization was shredding whatever part of him was still whole. France was only the beginning, because when the SAS entered Germany itself and the war descended into its final, desperate, feral stage, Mayne's brutality evolved into something the world still struggles to define. Crossing into Germany was like stepping into a different universe. France had been battered, occupied, scarred. But Germany was wounded and furious, cornered, desperate. Its soldiers were no longer confident professionals fighting for victory. They were cornered animals fighting to survive the collapse of their entire world. That kind of enemy is the most dangerous. And for a man like Paddy Mayne, that kind of enemy was the perfect opponent. By early 1945, the war was a broken skeleton of itself. Cities were reduced to molten steel and shattered stone. Forests were carved into trenches of mud and bone. Roads were filled with fleeing civilians tangled with retreating soldiers. The Luftwaffe was almost gone. The Wehrmacht was barely functioning. But the SS, fanatical, vicious, indoctrinated to the core, kept fighting with the cruelty of men who knew what waited for them if they surrendered. This was the world Mayne walked into. And he walked into it like a man entering a burning church, calm, intentional, and completely unbothered by the flames. The SAS role had shifted. No longer just sabotage and infiltration. Now they hunted. They tracked SS units fleeing east. They intercepted convoys of officers trying to escape into the mountains. They targeted command posts, safe houses, and strong points the Germans believed were hidden. Mayne had a talent for sniffing out fear. He knew where enemies would run before they even moved. One cold morning near the Ruhr, intelligence pointed to a fortified barracks acting as a regrouping point for high-ranking German officers. Most commanders would plan a slow, cautious assault. Not Mayne. He led his men right up to the perimeter, studying the guards like he was analyzing prey. And then, without waiting for artillery or backup, he launched the attack at dawn. The firefight lasted less than 30 minutes. 30 minutes for Mayne to break 100 men. He moved through the smoke with a predator's stillness, checking bodies with a knife in hand, stabbing anyone who twitched. He cleared rooms like the building was an extension of his own body. Swift, efficient, lethal. His men followed, struggling to keep up. The sound of gunfire echoed through the hallways like thunder trapped in a metal box. Grenades rolled under beds. Rifles exploded into life. Shouts in German turned to screams, then silence. In the basement, they found the commanding officer hiding behind barrels of fuel. One of Mayne's men shouted for him to surrender. The officer dropped his gun, hands in the air, face pale with terror. A lesser soldier would have taken him prisoner. Mayne didn't believe in lesser. He dragged the officer into the light by his collar. The man begged in broken English. Mayne didn't reply. He didn't consider it a conversation. He didn't consider the officer a human being. He lifted his Lee Enfield rifle like a hammer and brought it down with a force that broke bone on the first hit, smashed skull on the second, and obliterated what remained on the third. The man who witnessed it said the sound was like dropping a watermelon off a rooftop. Mayne didn't wipe the blood from his uniform. He didn't say anything. He walked back upstairs, stepped over bodies, and told his men to burn everything inside the barracks. By noon, the entire building was a towering inferno, sending black smoke into the sky. German soldiers who found the charred remains days later thought the place had been hit by artillery. They had no idea it was done by one man with a rifle in a rage he could barely contain. But that was just the beginning of what Germany would witness. Mayne had never fought an enemy on their own soil before, and something about that ignited a fire in him he had never unleashed fully, not in Africa, not in Sicily, not in France. This was enemy territory. This was the heart of the beast. Every village he entered, every road he crossed, every forest he moved through carried the scent of cruelty the Nazis had inflicted for years, and Mayne fed that scent back to them. In one operation, his unit intercepted a fleeing SS convoy moving through a narrow road lined with pine trees. Retreating SS soldiers often traveled disguised as farmers, medics, even priests. But Mayne could spot the stiffness of an SS man from 50 yards away. They were trained to never bow their heads, never soften their shoulders, never walk like broken men, and that pride gave them away. Mayne didn't wait. He ordered a full-speed ambush. Jeeps burst out from the tree line like wolves exploding from the shadows. Machine guns tore through the first truck, flipping it onto its side. Bodies flew out, some landing on rocks, some crushed underneath the wreckage. The second truck tried to reverse, but Mayne rammed it with his own Jeep, sending men screaming out the back. He jumped out before his Jeep stopped moving. The killing was fast, methodical, silent, except for the guns. Some SS men tried to crawl away. Mayne walked through the snow, shooting them one by one. A medic begged for mercy. Mayne didn't pause. He fired a single shot through the man's forehead. An officer tried to run with his hands up. Mayne shot him in the spine, walked up to the body, and fired again. No hesitation, no guilt, no expression. His men burned the trucks. They torched the bodies with them. No evidence, no paperwork, no survivors. German units later found nothing but blackened metal and scorched earth. They assumed it had been bombed. Mayne was becoming a one-man apocalypse. But there was a price. Always a cost. He was unraveling, not outwardly. Outwardly, he was stone. But inside, something was cracking deeper than any wound. He slept less and drank more. He stared longer at the bodies. He kept trophies, dog tags, medals, pieces of equipment from the men he killed. Not out of pride, but out of something harder to explain. Something like obsession. Some of his own men began to fear him. They followed him into hell because he could lead them out. But they knew that if they made a mistake, Mayne wouldn't hesitate to discipline them the same way he dealt with enemies. With violence first, questions later. On one occasion, a young soldier panicked under fire and nearly blew the team's cover. After the fight, Mayne didn't shout. He didn't insult. He simply grabbed the soldier by the throat, slammed him against a wall, and told him in a flat voice that if he ever hesitated again, he'd kill him himself before the Germans got the chance. The soldier believed him. Everyone believed him. By April 1945, the German collapse had become a tidal wave. Cities were surrendering, armies were dissolving, and the SS was running for its life. Mayne hunted them with the cold determination of a man who had finally found something worthy of his fury. Near the Rhine, he discovered a fortified factory complex being used to store ammunition. Instead of organizing teams and planning a slow assault, he gathered 4 men, walked straight toward the main gate in broad daylight, and opened fire. The defenders panicked. They weren't expecting an attack that bold, that reckless, that is swing. Mayne thrived on that. He used unpredictability like a weapon. He kicked open doors, threw grenades into rooms, and shot anything that moved. The explosion of the ammunition depot was so violent, it shattered windows half a mile away. His men barely escaped the shockwave. Mayne didn't run. He walked out of the inferno, soot covering his face, uniform scorched, eyes empty. They said he looked like death wearing British insignia. A few days later, he raided an airfield. Most of the planes were already grounded, but Mayne didn't just plant explosives and leave. He climbed into cockpits, smashing gauges, ripping out wiring, beating the metal frames with whatever he had in his hands. When he was done, he poured fuel over the aircraft himself and lit them with a match. 16 planes went up in flames. Some exploded so violently, debris rained down on his own men. Mayne watched calmly, hands in his pockets. He didn't blink. He didn't flinch. He didn't look away. Allied command later said his actions in Germany accelerated the collapse of enemy resistance. Those were polite words. The truth was less polite. He traumatized the Germans into surrendering faster. But with every mission, every kill, every explosion, Mayne was losing parts of himself he would never get back. He had become the perfect weapon, but the man behind the weapon was fading. His temper grew shorter. His silence grew heavier. His eyes grew colder. Before missions, he stared at maps like they were crime scenes. After missions, he stared at the ground like he was trying to remember what it felt like not to be surrounded by death. When Germany finally surrendered in May 1945, Allied soldiers cheered. Civilians cried. Bells rang across liberated towns. Mayne did none of those things. He stood alone, hands behind his back, staring out at a landscape of ruins, and for the first time, the men beside him realized something horrifying. Paddy Mayne didn't look relieved the war was over. He looked disappointed, because the battlefield had been the only place where he truly felt alive. And now the world expected him to return to something he had never been built for: peace. When the war finally ended, most soldiers felt relief. Paddy Mayne felt nothing. Victory didn't free him, it trapped him. The battlefield had been the only place where the noise in his head made sense. Now the guns were silent, but the war inside him wasn't. He walked through peaceful streets like a predator forced into a zoo, pacing behind invisible bars. Every sudden sound made him twitch. Every shadow made his hand curl, like he was reaching for a weapon he no longer carried. He tried going back to normal life, but normal life didn't want him. Law books meant nothing. Courtrooms felt like cages. He'd stare at pages for hours and barely register a word. People expected him to be proud of what he'd done. They thought he'd tell stories, laugh at old battles, smile at medals. They didn't understand that the things he'd seen and the things he'd done weren't memories. They were scars that didn't bleed but never healed. When London refused him the Victoria Cross, it wasn't the medal he cared about. It was the message behind it. They wanted the results of his brutality, but not the truth of it. They wanted what he did in war, not who he had to become to do it. They needed men like him, until peace arrived. Then they didn't know where to put him. He started drinking. Hard. Nights blurred together. Pubs became battlegrounds without bullets. If someone insulted him or so much as looked at him wrong, he reacted with the same instinct that kept him alive during ambushes. One punch from him could end a conversation, a fight, or a man. People weren't afraid of his size. They were afraid of his silence, his eyes, the way he stood too still, the way he seemed half present, like part of him was still in Germany, waiting for a rifle to jam or a grenade to roll under his feet. Sleep offered no escape. Nightmares dragged him back into burning buildings and moonlit raids. He woke up gasping, soaked in sweat, sometimes on the floor, sometimes gripping furniture he didn't remember throwing. He became a ghost haunting his own life. A man who survived war but couldn't survive the absence of it. Friends drifted away. Family tiptoed around him. The world was moving on, rebuilding, celebrating. But Mayne didn't rebuild. He stayed frozen in the ruins. The one thing that had given him purpose, combat, was gone. And without it, he felt hollow, useless, out of place in a world that suddenly expected him to be gentle. Stories emerged later, stories that showed both the darkness and the fragments of humanity still inside him. Like the time he rescued a block of civilians from SS retaliation, killing the entire German detachment alone. Or the time he saved British prisoners by storming a barn without orders, cutting the guards down before they could blink. But there were darker stories too, spoken only in whispers. Stories of wounded prisoners he executed on instinct, of rooms he cleared with rage instead of bullets, of moments where the line between necessary and unnecessary violence blurred until it vanished. People argue which stories are true. It doesn't matter. What matters is this. The war had shown him what he was capable of, and he could never forget it. He drifted through the last years of his life like a man caught between worlds, too dangerous for peace, too human to stay in war. He spent long nights driving through the countryside, headlights cutting through fog like tracer fire. Maybe he was chasing silence. Maybe he was running from it. Maybe he just couldn't sit still long enough to let the past catch him. Then came the early morning of December 14th, 1955. A quiet road, damp asphalt, no traffic, no witnesses. His car veered off the road and slammed into a lamppost. No skid marks, no sign of evasive action, no sign he even tried to survive. The official report called it an accident, but those who knew him didn't buy it. They knew that Paddy Mayne had survived the impossible too many times to die by mistake. Whether he fell asleep, whether a memory distracted him, or whether he finally gave up fighting a war no one else could see, only he knew. He was 40 years old, and in a way the war had never ended for him. After his death, the myth grew. Soldiers said he was the most terrifying man they ever saw in battle. Civilians said he was a quiet giant who carried invisible weight. Historians called him one of the greatest special forces operators who ever lived. The SAS built their entire modern doctrine on his tactics. His raids are still studied today. His methods are still imitated. His legacy is still whispered, with respect and a little fear. Because Paddy Mayne revealed something uncomfortable about war, something people prefer to ignore. War doesn't create monsters. It releases the ones already inside us. Some men go to war and come back broken. Some come back stronger. But a few, very few, discover that war is the only place they were ever truly alive. Paddy Mayne was one of those few. He was not the monster war made. He was the monster war uncovered. And once he saw what he could become on the battlefield, there was no way back.